God is good, and this is the Nathan Napalm channel. If you are not already subscribed, please consider doing so, especially if you're interested in RPGs, JRPGs, MMORPGs, especially the old school ones, because that's what we cover here, and of course, Pantheon: Rise of the Fallen. But today, guys, I want to talk about the very beginning for me for RPGs and how I fell in love with this genre and how I fell in love with everything dealing with role-playing games and how it all began. Because actually, the first time I saw a role-playing video game was at a guy's house who was a friend of my dad's, or I think maybe my dad was actually doing some construction work on his house, I'm not sure. But anyway, he popped in Final Fantasy on the NES, and I remember he was talking about how awesome it was, and he was trying to explain it to me, had no idea what he was talking about, and it looked lame. I was thinking in my brain, I can't believe this. The computer is deciding if you win or not. All you do is press fight or magic, and then that's it. And I was like, wow, this looks lame. And I was not impressed. I walked away thinking, this is the dumbest thing I've ever seen in my life. And I was just super young, guys. And I just didn't get it yet. I didn't understand the strategy, etc. And that was that. Well, then my curiosity got the best of me, and I kind of started wondering about these kind of games. There had to be something about them. There had to be something. That guy was super excited. And I did like the overworld map system that was, for that time, felt 3D, where you could walk in many different directions. I hadn't even played Zelda yet. This was a really long time ago, and the only experiences I'd had where you could move in that kind of way was something like maybe Contra, where you had the levels where it's overhead. So I was super interested in an adventure like that and being able to do that, but I didn't understand how it would work or any of the systems or anything. Well, then one day, randomly, my father decides to buy me at the same time The Legend of Zelda for NES and Final Fantasy. Those two games, I was sitting in the car on the ride home, had no idea what kind of games I had, but as I'm all excited, I'm opening them up, wondering what are these games going to be like. And I remember when I opened the Final Fantasy box, it had a map, a fold-out map of the world, and I was just like, how is this possible that it's going to have this entire world, and how do you travel to all these places? I was just blown away already. Like, how is this going to work? This can't be possible. And I just couldn't believe it. Now, so what happened was I got home, I popped in Final Fantasy first, because it was the one I was really like, what is going on here? What's this going to be about? And I fell in love. I loved the fact that you had to grind, that it was hard, that you went out into the world. It was like this real adventure, and it felt like there was all this freedom of where you wanted to go and how deep you wanted to dive into these dungeons, and you had to be careful, and you had to get supplies from the town, and you had to upgrade your magic, and you picked what classes you brought with you, and made names for them, and had all these options. You had to pick which spells your white mage would have, what spells your black mage would have. It was, what weapons you would carry for your warrior. It was just insane. And you got to pick 4 characters, and there was many options for what those 4 slots would end up being. I think in my original playthrough, I went with what I still love today, which is the warrior, black belt, black mage, and white mage. And that is the combo I like to do even today. I did a recent playthrough of this game just for nostalgia. I wanted to replay the entire game, and I got an original NES. I got an original cartridge of it. I put it in, and I played it just like the old days, and it was a blast. That game is super fun. There's a lot of things I realized as an adult, by the way, that I didn't realize as a kid. Like, some of the abilities actually just straight up don't work. Like, they just don't work at all. Like the Thief, for example, is actually a completely useless class in that game, but that's besides the point. Back then, I just could not believe that this was possible, and for anybody who's played the original Final Fantasy, you know that it's like a gift that just keeps giving. There were so many innovations on that game, it's no wonder it became such a huge success, because, for example, besides all the things I've already talked about, another amazing part is that at a certain point in the game, your characters get older, and they become adults, and their classes change, they evolve. They can become paladins or become wizards, and they get even crazier amazing freaking spells and things they can do at that point. It's like their true potential unlocks, and it just simply blew my little kid brain wide open. I just could not believe it. It was like a dragon that I continued chasing for the rest of my life. And as I moved over from the Nintendo Entertainment System and moved over to the Sega Genesis, not to say there were not good RPGs on the Genesis, but as many of us know, it was not a huge library of RPGs, and I remember I kind of suffered there. Shining Force, freaking awesome, love it, but just not quite what I wanted. And you know, I really had to move over to the Super Nintendo to get my fix, and I actually originally, not long after getting the Super Nintendo, ended up getting a Sega Saturn. Sega Saturn had some hits on it, Panzer Dragoon Saga Anybody, ridiculously great RPG, and my love just continued from there. Another cool thing about RPGs was, you know, my friends didn't play them. They were playing more of like the Contra type games, Metroid, you know, Mario, that kind of thing, platformers. They hadn't really gotten into this genre yet, or even really knew about it. And Zelda was kind of like an entry-level RPG, I remember at that time for me, back in that was probably about the late 80s, maybe early 90s. But anyway, I remember that's how I would get them kind of into this kind of genre, was I would lead them on with Zelda. I let people borrow my copy of Zelda, let them try it out. They'd end up getting their own copy. Then I would start talking about Final Fantasy and how it was even crazier, and how much strategy, and how you had to do all these things. And I eventually got a lot of my friends in on the RPG and loving those as well. And there was a lot of options at that time as kids for RPG adventures, but I never quite found one that I fell in love with on the NES quite as much as that original Final Fantasy. I would just stay up all night. I would pretend like I was going to bed, put a little towel under the crack on the door so nobody could see the TV light, crack it on, and just tear it up through the night, grinding and diving into these dungeons and leveling up and getting a little bit further in the story, trying to figure out how to get further in the story, because the game didn't hold your hand back then. It would just kind of, you kind of had to figure out what you were supposed to be doing next, especially when you got the airship or even just the boat, and you could travel to all these new areas all across this, at that time, gargantuan map, to all these locations and villages, and you had to talk to everybody, and you had to figure out what you were even supposed to be doing next. And it just felt like I was exploring this huge digital world and going on these wild adventures. And then I got to go back to school, and they'd be like, I'm stuck at this part, and I'd be like, dude, you have to go get the raft in the desert, you know, and all this kind of, it was just so cool, man. Such a great memory of mine from those times. It's really what led me to become who I am today and the kind of games that I love today. And that initial love for RPGs went even further into MMOs when EverQuest came out, Dark Age of Camelot, and I started exploring that now they had RPGs you could experience with other people, and it still had that same kind of feel, that exploration, that mystery, that interaction between you and the world, and it was just crazy. It still blows my mind today that Final Fantasy released when it did. The story behind the game, now that I'm older and I've looked back at what Square Enix was doing, that they were a company going, you know, almost under, and this was going to be like their final hurrah, and it actually ended up saving the company. Therefore, that's why they actually, originally was going to be called Fighting Fantasy, and then they changed the name to Final Fantasy due to what was going on at that time in Squaresoft. I think I said Square Enix earlier, but Squaresoft it was back then, in their corporate life. So I just love it. I wanted to share that little story. I know that many people have stories similar. And another interesting thing I have to say before I end this video about the Final Fantasy series in particular that I think is most amazing is, as I've talked to so many people who's played these games or loves these games or used to love these games or whatever, it seems like there's something I've noticed, and that's whatever your first Final Fantasy that you actually played through was, typically is your favorite Final Fantasy. And that's something you can find all across the internet and everything. It's an interesting phenomenon. So I played Final Fantasy 1 first. That was my very first one, and it has a very special place in my heart because it spawned my entire love for the genre and what video games could be, that they could tell stories, that they could be this big adventure, that they could be larger than life and just amazing. So it definitely holds a very special place in my heart. I cannot say, however, that it is my favorite Final Fantasy now that I'm older. I think, me personally, you want to know my favorite Final Fantasy, I'm going to have to go with Final Fantasy 9. 6 is a very close second, but Final Fantasy 9 to me just was everything I love about Final Fantasy, all combined into one game. Beautiful art style that went back to kind of their roots on the way they designed the characters, in my opinion, to make them look like the older graphic models or pixelated models that they did before, and so that is my favorite. But in most people's case, the first one is their favorite. What do you guys think? Do you like the Final Fantasy series? Did you used to like it? What is your favorite Final Fantasy game? Did you play the original Final Fantasy way back then on the NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System? Did you have a similar experience to mine? Let me know, what was it like for you playing this groundbreaking game? Or if you didn't play this one, then, you know, whatever your first Final Fantasy was, let me know what it was. Is it your favorite one? And what happened to you? And what's your story on that? Guys, thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this little brief look back into time for the Napalm. And until next time, God bless and happy gaming. Please listen to what I say. I've been making videos all day. My friends all say I'm it's a video buffet. You can even hit replay. But please just subscribe. I can't even describe being part of my tribe. I'll even offer you a prize. But just please just subscribe and hit the bell notification too.